I tell you, friends, you hear an introduction like that, and I must confess to you, only one thing goes through my mind. That's a story we tell at home about a rabbi and a priest who went to a prize fight together. And when the story says that when the little Jewish boy came into the ring, he jumped up and down, he flexed his muscles, he beat on his chest, and he went to his corner. When the little Catholic kid got into the ring, he jumped up and down, he flexed his muscles, he beat on his chest, he made the sign of the cross, and he went to his corner. Rabbi looked at the priest and he said, "Is that going to help him?" The priest said, "Only if he can fight." So I want to thank you for your lovely attempt, and I hope you were right. We heard in song and in marvelous presentation, especially from Pastor Zenya, that we're being called to a new way of seeing, he said, a new way of engaging. It's a great focus for this conference. It's a great call to start the day. But at the same time, we must be real. The question is, what is this caring society? What is any caring society? How would you know it if you saw it? Is such a thing even possible? Are we asking too much? Is this more poetry than politics? And if not, then what's blocking it? And if so, how do we form this caring, compassionate heart? First in ourselves, tested in ourselves, and then passed on to others. Well, I reflected on questions like that with several other stories in mind. I heard a story that said more to me, for instance, about the meaning of a caring society and compassion than any academic answer ever could. One day, this story tells, a man realized how fortunate he was to have his wonderful wife. So he said to God, "Why did you make her so kind-hearted?" And God responded, "So you'd love her, my son." So he thought for a few minutes and he said, "Well then, God, why did you make her so good-looking?" And the voice of God came back, "So you would love her, my son." The man thought for a minute and then he said, I don't want to seem ungrateful, God, but why did you make her so stupid?" And God responded, "So she would love you, my son." I got the point. So much of what we call the good life is really a result, isn't it, of the purely gratuitous love from others that we have received. And then I heard two other stories that were even clearer icons to me of what it means to imagine a world at peace through compassion, what it means to set out to be and to build a caring society. One day, a Zen master taught, the traveler Shoshu fell down in the snow and called out, help me up." So a monk came and lay down beside him. Then Shoshu got up and went away. That story made a point too, doesn't it? Compassion, I came to realize, is the courage to immerse ourselves in the pain of another as surely as we would feel our own. Until their burden shared, they can rise on their own. The third story was most pointed of them all. Tetsugen, a devotee of Zen, set out to publish the Buddhist sutras in Japanese. It would be expensive, but it was a major religious undertaking, and it was worth it. It took Tetsugen 10 years to beg enough money to begin that task. But just when he had the money in hand, the Uji River overflowed. Crops failed and famine followed. So Tetsugen took the funds he had collected for the books and spent them on food for the starving instead. Then Tetsugen began to collect the money again. Several years after that, however, an epidemic spread over the entire country. This time, Tetsugen took the money he had collected to translate the scriptures into Japanese and used it to care for the sick and the dying instead. For a third time, he tramped the country to collect the money he needed to start this work. And finally, this time, after 20 years of begging, his wish was fulfilled. The printing blocks which produced the first edition of those sutras can still be seen today in Obaku Monastery in Kyoto. But they say that when the Japanese bring their children to see them, they tell the children that Tetsugen actually made 3 sets of sutras, and that the first 2 invisible sets surpassed even the last. Third point, compassion is a gift that comes out of deep spiritual conviction and the commitment it breeds to take another person's suffering seriously. However ancient these stories of self-sacrifice for the good of others may be, the truth is that they happen all the time. They're happening in cultures and traditions all over the world, here and now as we sit and hope. I know a young couple, for instance, newly married, hardly settled in, who after seeing a story on television about the situation of orphans in Sierra Leone, the poorest country in the world, got up the next day and started making phone calls to embassies and congresspersons till they made the connection that put them on a plane to Kampala to establish the residency requirements that would legitimize their application of adoption there. Today, they have 1 child, blonde as gold, blue eyes as bright as sapphires, and 3 very dark, very different African children, each child more beautiful, more contented than the next. You know, too, that after the United States invaded Iraq, bombed its infrastructures to dust, and destroyed its social system, one gorgeous Iraqi child, caught in this cauldron of hate and despair, was randomly doused with gasoline, remember the story, and set on fire. His head and face were burned beyond recognition, and the pitiful defamation of it all took his future, took his normalcy, and took his personality with it. At the age of 5 years old, that little child sank into anger and bitterness and deep, deep, reclusive depression. American citizens, all strangers to the child, all of them at war, they were told, with the world from which the child came, arranged regardless to bring that little boy to the United States, where plastic surgeons in California are to this day, little by little by little, making him another face with which to brave the world. He eats now and talks now, and best of all, he laughs and goes to school as well. In 2004, the largest tsunami ever recorded on the planet, the 2nd deadliest earthquake of all time, struck Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, Thailand, and the Maldives, leaving over 229,000 people dead within minutes. Within minutes. Humanitarian aid poured in from all over the world, from stranger to stranger. The response was national, international, and individual. It wasn't the charity of the affluent or the public gestures of politicians. The concern and compassion and commitment to those homeless and orphaned and desperately poor stretched all the way around the globe. I saw a woman in Ireland, in fact, where the haunt of famine is still a very real memory, get up one morning and invite her friends to a $200 a plate dinner of soup and soda bread and salad and stew in her own home for the privilege of rescuing people she did not know. In one night, she made $50,000 for the cause, from Irish citizens far too close to being poor themselves. It's all true. It's all newspaper stuff. It's people I myself know. And yet at the same time, we read about the abuse of children and the murder of the elderly and the beating of the innocent and the fleecing of the ignorant and of armies that rape and pillage and practice genocide as an official act of war. We read of scams that break the economy of an entire nation and pollution that poisons the globe and people who exploit and demean and deny others their rights, their dignity, their equality, their humanity. The very thought of it all is mind-boggling. The very thought of those things, too, leave the soul breathless. How do we account for so much inhumane treatment by one human being of another? Or just as seriously, how do we account for such reckless compassion in the midst of such cloying evil? Even more important, perhaps, ask yourself, are such things really compassion at all? Or are they simply self-seeking or posturing or manipulation, maybe, under the guise of goodness? Were all these people really about compassion, or were they just looking for another tax break? In fact, is there really such a thing as compassion, as selflessness at all? And if so, where does it come from? And how do you get it? And what does that mean to you and me and this conference and who we are when we leave it? The question is a classic one. Scholars, in fact, have been debating it for years. Some say compassion is a given. Others say compassion is a scam. The interpretation or over-interpretation, perhaps, of scientists like Dawkins and Hamilton, Williams and Wilson, for instance, and their theory of the selfish gene argues that we do good, you and I, not to help other persons, but to satisfy ourselves. And that position is not really new. Bernard Mandeville, an English moral philosopher of the 17th century, first posed the question that has shaped the nature of the problem for over 400 years until this very morning. The question as he posed it is a clear one. If you see a child about to be dropped into a fire pit, Mandeville asked, and you lunge to catch it, are you saving the baby because you're really convinced that the life of that other must be saved, or because of what we now call aversion arousal, because the very thought of burning flesh makes you sick? If you risk yourself, Mandeville argued, to save yourself the sight, the smell, the distress of such pain, then there is no such thing as compassion. There is only self-satisfaction that sometimes seems to function in favor of the common good, but is actually quite self-serving. If you save the child in order to save the life of a stranger who has no claim on you, the Mandeville question challenges us. Why would you bother? Except for your own gratification. So who's right and why? Is there a basic goodness in us? Or do Jesus and the Talmud, the Brahma, the Buddha, and the prophet present the world with an ideal beyond the possible? Answers to those questions abound. Whole institutions, in fact, now exist devoted entirely to this issue. The Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford University and California, for instance. No small sight indeed. The Center for Ethics and the Emory-Tibetan Partnership at Emory University in Atlanta, a relatively new program in a world ever more in need of compassion. The Max Planck Institute in Germany, a long-established research center in human behavior, as well as a growing number of others. They're everywhere. They're in every curriculum.